Yeah, so from my experience, I'll take this in a couple of directions. The first directions is my earliest experience with Bitcoin, so that we can draw some connections. And secondly, what I've noticed with Bitcoin adoption over the decades. My earliest experience with Bitcoin was actually when I was living in London. And I was invited to by a gentleman called Johnny Bitcoin, and he was part of the monetary reform movement, and he had attended one of my presentations on monetary reform, and he actually sold his house to put all of his money into Bitcoin, based upon his belief around the problems with money. And this was 2010, 2011. And he actually sold his house to move into a squat in London where a bunch of hackers were working on the original versions of the Bitcoin code. And that was very much an activist movement. They had taken over a property, and they turned it into a hub for coding up on Bitcoin. After that, I was invited to speak at the first Bitcoin conference from the same person was organizing that conference in Prague, that was actually working on Bitcoin core code. And again, it came from an activist background. And the first Bitcoin conference was very much really focused around two topics: technology, that was beyond my technical understanding at the time, but it was all very exciting, and us versus the banks movement. And Bitcoin was very much a movement against banking. And that was interestingly evidenced by the message that was contained in the first Bitcoin block, when it was talking about a reference from the Times newspaper in the UK, where banks on the brink of financial disaster, and the governor of England at the time was going to bail out the banks, and that was referenced in the very first block in Bitcoin. So all my experience in the early days were people that really wanted to deliver more freedom, and create a competing force to the unsustainable nature of banking. And all of that was connected to my first experience was obviously because I lived in the UK at the time. And my second experience was from traveling to places like Czech Republic, and other European places where many of the early people were getting involved. So that was the early experiences that I have, and it was very much around a anti-banking movement and an alternative. It wasn't really about making money. It was about the technology and creating something that would work without banks. A lot later, it became about it had monetary value, and then people were talking about its monetary value. But that was very much a second use case. The thing that I've experienced over the years is that there is a large percentage of Bitcoin interest that comes from people that just see this as an alternative asset class. They see the returns that have been achieved, 9 million % returns in 10 years. And they see it as a way of speculating or trying to get rich quick. And that is a large percentage of people's first introduction to it, since the early activists, us versus the banks days. But then what we see is that you get pockets of adoption centered around particular use cases. And so one of the early bits of adoption in Bitcoin was when people realized that they could use Bitcoin where they couldn't use a bank or a credit card. And so the early use cases were things where, due to regulatory gray areas, you couldn't actually use the traditional financial system, for example, gambling sites. But then people used it for transacting in activities that were, banned in certain countries but legal in other countries. For example, the purchase of drugs, which in some countries was legal, in other countries illegal to buy certain drugs. And so Bitcoin became like a bridge mechanism, and that's where a lot of its questionable reputation from everyday people comes from, because of those early use cases of being able to transact. But then other interesting use cases came along where people are doing things completely legal, but governments may not necessarily want to perform those legal activities. For example, independence of the press. And so when WikiLeaks was targeted by the banking, credit card, Visa, MasterCard, Bank of England, and Bank of America, when they tried to blockade it and censor it through finance, it stayed alive and it had to accept Bitcoin, and Bitcoin had a significant return. So Wikipedia was pretty much funded by Bitcoin growth. And that's due to the necessity of having to transact where censorship exists. You're not necessarily doing anything illegal, but politics stops you from transacting. And that was really the next wave of adoption. After that, we had use cases like the 2013 Cyprus bail-ins led to another Bitcoin pump, where people started to realize that the money at a bank isn't actually yours. It can be used by a bank in order to recapitalize itself if it takes bad risks. And so we saw pockets of adoption as a result of that. And I think we then entered a phase of years and years of new people finding new reasons to use Bitcoin. We had a spike in Bitcoin adoption during the Indian demonetization, where certain cash was being made illegal, and everybody was being forced to digitize their money into the Indian banking system. And more recently, people are the main use case that I think people are driving into right now is people are questioning the amount of money that's being created as a result of the recession/depression we're in right now. And therefore, people are starting to realize that Bitcoin's fixed money supply is a reason to want to be involved and own an asset that has digital scarcity. So in summary, it was founded on the Bitcoin versus the bank's mission. Because banks give you the opportunity to own your own money and spend your own money, censorship resistance and the ability to own your own asset became important. And more recently, the fact that it's scarce and has a fixed supply is attracting the attention from people not understanding all of the money printing. And I think that brings us to where we are today and Bitcoin's evolution from the decade I've been involved. Yeah, they all believe that banking was a scam. They all believe that fiat currencies were unsustainable and could lead to a collapse. They all believe that privacy is important, and that the ability to be able to transact stopping that is a form of censorship, and that affects their freedoms, their personal liberties, and is an attack on freedom of speech. Many people believe that freedom to transact is a form of freedom of speech. No, I was one of the only people involved from the banking and finance industry. Most people were anarchists, activists, technology people, computer scientists, and cypherpunks from the banking and finance industry. Even if they believed that there were problems in traditional finance, they didn't believe that anything else could be created or exist outside. And Bitcoin was so doomed to fail that no one was interested. But it was, a very unglamorous room that, felt like just an ordinary conference room in a very normal building. There was obviously no high budgets for this.
Right.
But what was more interesting is actually the after event hackathon, which is where you had to actually go around Czech Republic, those codes. You could uncrypt a message. It would then take you to the next location. And after about 3 or 4 of these, you ended up in a building that really just looked like a very dangerous crack den. But then you kept walking through the building, and it was you'd eventually get to this room where you had to knock on the door in a certain way. And then once you got in, you could buy. There was a Bitcoin QR code that would allow you to buy like a Mars bar for 1 Bitcoin, and you could. And there was a bunch of people with hoodies and anonymous masks hacking away. I do think that people that could not access their funds, people that were suppressed by banks, people that were really indebted. These were the people globally that found Bitcoin and found it attractive. Plus, they obviously had to be technically minded, because most people were. Unless you could discuss the technology, there really wasn't much to discuss. I was really the only person that wasn't a technical person, that could discuss it from the economic side, and no one else was discussing the economic side because it was just simply this thing that was doomed to fail. Yeah, necessity is the mother of all invention. And the only reason that I looked at Bitcoin is because I was trying to solve how to create a non-fractional reserve bank. And because there was no way of actually creating a non-fractional reserve bank where people could own their money, spend their money, there was no legal or technical way of achieving it built upon the existing banking system. And so I was looking for a solution. I had a problem that needed solving, and Bitcoin was solving that problem. So for me, I had a unique angle of why I was interested in this thing, which I don't think anyone else was really interested in. So, and really for me, it was a way of building a non-fractional reserve bank that captured my imagination. And I was part of the monetary reform community, which was a tiny niche community of people discussing, before the financial crisis, the problems with banking. And bankers were just too busy making money. And it wasn't until 2007 that some of them lost their jobs, and therefore they had to actually start exploring what happened. And really, the financial crisis just accelerated the conversation around money. And then Bitcoin hit a monetary value eventually where more and more people couldn't ignore it. But nobody was interested in it, and I can, thousands of people, I think hundreds of people that I pitched Bitcoin to, and none of them bought it. Many of them, I gave it to them for free, and then they just lost it because they just didn't care.